Welcome, friend, to another journey together. Feel free to share where you are listening from and what time it is. I'm going to share a thoughtfully chosen collection of profound Zen stories that have guided countless seekers toward inner stillness and the most tranquil rest of their lives. Let's begin with our first story. At the foot of a mist-covered mountain in ancient Japan, there stood a small, simple hut made of wood and bamboo. This humble dwelling belonged to Ryokan, a Zen master who had chosen to live with almost nothing. His possessions consisted of a single bowl, a worn robe, and a few sacred texts. The walls of his hut were bare, except for shadows cast by moonlight, and his floor held only a thin mat for sleeping. Yet those who visited him always remarked on the profound peace that filled this simple space. Ryokan spent his days in meditation, writing poetry, and walking in the surrounding forest. He found joy in the smallest things: the sound of rain on his roof, the sight of cherry blossoms, the warmth of sunlight through his window. His happiness seemed to spring from sources invisible to most people, as if he had discovered treasures hidden in plain sight. One evening, as crickets sang their night songs and the moon climbed high above the mountain peaks, Ryokan had gone to the village to visit a sick friend. While he was away, a thief crept up the mountain path toward his hut. The thief had heard stories about the famous Zen master and assumed that someone so revered must possess valuable items, perhaps gold, silver, or precious artifacts. The thief carefully examined the hut from outside, listening for any sounds within. Hearing nothing, he slipped inside through the unlocked door. His eyes adjusted to the darkness, and he began searching methodically through the small space. He looked in every corner, examined every shadow, checked under the sleeping mat, but there was nothing to steal. The hut contained not a single item of monetary value. As the thief stood there in confusion, he heard footsteps approaching on the mountain path. Panicking, he crouched in the darkest corner, hoping to hide until the occupant fell asleep. But when Ryokan entered, he immediately noticed the presence of another person. "You may have come a long way to visit me," Ryokan said gently, his voice free of alarm or anger. "And you should not return empty-handed. Please take my clothes as a gift." The thief was bewildered. No one had ever responded to his presence with such kindness and generosity. He had expected fear, anger, or calls for help, but instead found himself facing a man who seemed genuinely concerned for his welfare. Ryokan began removing his robe, folding it carefully and extending it toward the confused intruder. The thief took the clothes with trembling hands and slunk away into the night, his mind spinning with questions he couldn't answer. He had never encountered anyone like this strange monk, who gave away his possessions to someone who had come to steal them. After the thief disappeared down the mountain path, Ryokan sat naked outside his hut, gazing up at the full moon. Its silver light bathed the mountainside in ethereal beauty, transforming the landscape into something magical and otherworldly. "Poor fellow," Ryokan murmured with genuine compassion. "I wish I could give him this beautiful moon." Buddha's wisdom reminds us, health is the greatest gift, contentment the greatest wealth, faithfulness the best relationship. Here we discover a teaching about the nature of true abundance and the poverty of endless wanting. Why do we spend so much energy accumulating possessions when the greatest treasures cannot be owned? Zen Buddhism points to our fundamental confusion about the source of happiness. We believe that security comes from having things, but Ryokan demonstrates that true security comes from needing nothing. We think wealth means possession, but he shows us that wealth means the capacity to give freely. This tale unveils the profound difference between having and being. The thief came seeking objects he could carry away, but Ryokan possessed something that cannot be stolen, a deep contentment that springs from within. The moon, symbol of this inner radiance, illuminates all equally and belongs to no one and everyone simultaneously. Consider how much of our life energy goes toward protecting what we own versus cultivating what we are. We lock our doors, buy insurance, worry about theft or loss, yet rarely put the same effort into developing the inner qualities that create lasting happiness. Ryokan's response to the thief reveals someone who has internalized the truth that generosity multiplies joy while hoarding diminishes it. The Buddha said, "If you knew what I know about the power of giving, you would not let a single meal pass without sharing it in some way." Ryokan's immediate impulse to give his clothes to the thief wasn't just kindness, it was wisdom. He understood that holding on to possessions creates separation between people, while giving creates connection and dissolves the barriers between self and other. Zen master Dogen taught, "To give is to receive." This paradox becomes clear when we examine our own experience. Think of times when you've given something meaningful to another person. Often, the joy of giving exceeds any pleasure you might have derived from keeping the item. The act of giving itself becomes the gift we receive. The moon in this story represents what Buddhism calls our Buddha nature, the inherent wholeness and radiance that exists within all beings. Like the moon, this inner light cannot be stolen, hoarded, or diminished by sharing. In fact, it grows brighter the more freely we allow it to shine. Ryokan's wish to give the moon to the thief expresses his desire to share this ultimate treasure, the recognition of our own complete nature. In our consumer culture, we're constantly told that happiness comes from acquiring more, but Ryokan's example suggests the opposite, that happiness comes from needing less and giving more. This doesn't mean we should live in poverty, but rather that we can hold our possessions lightly, seeing them as tools for service rather than sources of identity or security. The thief left with clothes, but missed the greater treasure. The example of a human being who had discovered unshakable peace through inner simplicity. He took something that could be worn out or lost, but walked away from something that could have transformed his entire life. Tonight, as you look at the moon or simply rest in the quiet of this moment, can you sense the wealth that cannot be stolen? The breath moving through your body, the awareness that perceives these words, the capacity for love and wonder that exists regardless of your circumstances. As the Buddha taught, better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace. The peace that Ryokan embodied is available to each of us when we stop grasping and learn to rest in our own inherent completeness. Now, let us explore a Zen story that takes place in a quiet monastery where 20 monks and one nun named Ishun practiced meditation together under the guidance of their Zen master. The morning air was crisp with the scent of incense, and the sound of wooden bells echoed softly through the stone corridors. Eshun moved through her daily practice with graceful presence, her shaved head catching the golden light that streamed through the temple windows. Despite her plain robes and simple appearance, Eshun possessed a natural beauty that drew the attention of several monks. They found themselves stealing glances during meditation, their minds wandering from their breath to thoughts of her gentle movements and serene countenance. One monk, particularly smitten, felt his heart race whenever she passed by. The weight of his feelings grew heavier each day until he could no longer contain them. In the quiet of his cell, he wrote her a letter confessing his love and requesting a private meeting. His hands trembled as he folded the paper, and he slipped it to her after the evening meal. He watched her face carefully as she read it, searching for any sign of reciprocal feeling, but Eshen's expression remained unchanged, calm as still water. She folded the letter quietly and continued with her evening practice, offering no response. The following day, the master delivered his regular teaching to the assembled group. The hall was filled with the soft rustle of robes and the gentle rhythm of synchronized breathing. When the lecture concluded, Eshen rose from her cushion with deliberate grace. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to her. She looked directly at the monk who had written the letter, her gaze steady and compassionate. "If you really love me so much," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall, "come and embrace me now." The monk's face flushed crimson. His heart pounded so loudly he was certain everyone could hear it. The other monks shifted uncomfortably, some looking away, others watching with fascination. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. In that instant, the monk understood. His love crumbled under the light of truth, revealed as nothing more than desire, fantasy, and attachment. Buddha's wisdom reminds us, you yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection. What emerges from this story is a profound teaching about the difference between true love and attachment disguised as love. Eshun's response cut through the monk's romantic illusion with the sharp blade of reality, revealing the conditional nature of what he called love. Why do we so often confuse desire with love? Zen Buddhism points to the ego's tendency to project our needs onto others, creating elaborate fantasies about connection while remaining fundamentally self-centered. The monk's love was based on Eshun's appearance and his own longing, not on genuine care for her well-being or spiritual growth. True love, as Buddhism teaches, is unconditional compassion that seeks nothing in return. Consider how often we attach the word love to experiences that are actually about possession, control, or the fulfillment of our own needs. We say we love someone, but what we really mean is that their presence makes us feel good, their attention validates us, or their beauty pleases us. This is not love, but attachment, and attachment inevitably leads to suffering. Zen teacher Suzuki Roshi observed, "Each of you is perfect the way you are, and you can use a little improvement." This paradox applies beautifully to love. We must love others as they are, not as we wish them to be, while simultaneously supporting their growth and awakening. The monk's letter revealed his desire to possess Eshun privately, to have her conform to his romantic fantasy, rather than honoring her path as a devoted practitioner. Eshun's response demonstrated what Zen calls fierce compassion, the willingness to cut through delusion even when it causes temporary discomfort. By exposing the monk's attachment publicly, she offered him and everyone present a teaching about the nature of authentic love versus romantic projection. True love acts for the beloved's highest good, even when that means destroying pleasant illusions. In our daily lives, we can practice this discernment by examining our relationships honestly. When we feel attracted to someone, are we seeing them clearly, or projecting our needs onto them. When we offer help or affection, are we genuinely serving their well-being or seeking something in return? The Buddha taught that loving kindness begins with self-awareness and extends outward through increasingly widening circles of genuine care. Tonight, as you reflect on the relationships in your life, can you distinguish between love and attachment? Can you offer care that asks nothing in return, that honors others' autonomy and spiritual journey? As the Buddha taught, hatred is never appeased by hatred in this world. By non-hatred alone is hatred appeased. This is a law eternal. True love dissolves the boundaries between self and other, creating space for authentic connection to flourish. Let us now turn to a tale that challenges our understanding of spiritual progress and genuine compassion. This is the story of the old woman's compassion test. In the mountains of ancient China, there lived an elderly woman whose generosity knew no bounds. For over 20 years, she had supported a monk's spiritual practice with unwavering dedication. She had built him a simple hut with her own hands using timber from the surrounding forest, and brought him food daily so he could devote himself entirely to meditation. Her weathered hands had kneaded countless loaves of bread. Her bent back had carried heavy loads up the mountain path, all out of faith that her support was nurturing genuine spiritual development. As the years passed, the woman began to wonder about the monk's progress. She observed him daily in his meditation posture, noting his peaceful demeanor and disciplined routine. Yet something stirred within her, a question that grew stronger with each passing season. What kind of wisdom had emerged from all these years of practice? What depth of compassion had he cultivated? Had her decades of support truly contributed to his spiritual awakening, or had she merely enabled comfortable withdrawal from the world? The old woman was not one to let questions fester. She was a practical person who believed that spiritual development should manifest in one's response to life's complexities, not just in the ability to sit peacefully in isolation. She devised a test that would reveal the true nature of the monk's attainment. She approached a young woman from the village, someone known for her warmth and natural sensuality. "I need your help," the old woman explained. "Go to the monk and embrace him. Show him genuine affection. Then ask him suddenly, 'What now?' I want to see how he responds to this unexpected situation." The young woman agreed, curious about this unusual request. She made her way up the mountain path to the monk's hut, her heart beating with nervous anticipation. When she arrived, she found the monk in his usual meditation posture, still as a statue. Without hesitation, she approached him and embraced him warmly, her touch conveying genuine human connection and affection. "What now?" she asked softly, looking into his eyes. The monk's response came immediately, his voice cold and distant. "An old tree grows on a cold rock in winter. Nowhere is there any warmth." The young woman felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She returned to the old woman and related exactly what the monk had said. The old woman's face darkened with disappointment and anger. "To think I fed that fellow for 20 years, she exclaimed. "He showed no consideration for your need, no disposition to explain your condition. He need not have responded to passion, but at least he should have evidenced some compassion." Without hesitation, the old woman marched up the mountain to the monk's hut and burned it to the ground. As the Buddha observed, compassion is not religious business. It is human business. It is not luxury. It is essential for our own peak survival. The heart of this lesson lies in understanding that true spiritual development must include the capacity for genuine human connection and appropriate response to others' needs. Why do we sometimes mistake spiritual detachment for spiritual accomplishment? Zen Buddhism warns against what it calls Zen sickness, the tendency to use spiritual concepts as shields against authentic engagement with life. The monk had achieved a kind of equanimity, but it was cold and lifeless, lacking the warmth of genuine compassion. The old woman's test revealed a crucial distinction between spiritual bypassing and authentic realization. The monk had learned to remain undisturbed by sensual temptation, but he had not learned to respond to human need with appropriate kindness. His poetic response about the cold tree revealed someone who had become emotionally frozen rather than spiritually liberated. Consider how often we encounter people who use spiritual concepts to avoid genuine engagement. They speak of detachment while remaining emotionally unavailable. They talk about non-attachment while showing indifference to others' suffering. They quote sacred texts while demonstrating little practical wisdom in their daily interactions. Zen Master Dogen taught, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by myriad things. True spiritual development doesn't create distance from life, but deeper engagement with it. The monk had studied himself in isolation, but had not learned to forget himself in service to others. The old woman's anger was not personal vindictiveness, but righteous indignation at wasted opportunity. She had invested decades in supporting someone's spiritual growth, only to discover that her generosity had enabled spiritual stagnation rather than authentic development. Her burning of the hut was a teaching itself, a dramatic demonstration that comfortable spiritual practice without genuine compassion is ultimately worthless. Ancient Buddhist wisdom tells us that the highest spiritual attainment includes skillful means, the ability to respond appropriately to each situation with wisdom and compassion. The monk could have acknowledged the young woman's courage in approaching him, offered gentle explanation of his vows, or shown appreciation for her humanity while maintaining his boundaries. Instead, he offered only cold poetry that dismissed her as if she were an inconvenience. Tonight, as you consider your own spiritual development, can you examine whether your practice increases your capacity for genuine connection or creates barriers to authentic engagement? Does your spiritual understanding make you more available to others' needs or more removed from them? The Buddha taught, if you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion. True spiritual progress is measured not by our ability to remain undisturbed, but by our capacity to respond to life with wisdom, warmth, and genuine care. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, we encounter a story about the transformation of fear into power. This is the tale of great waves. In the early days of the Meiji era, when Japan was opening to the world and old traditions met new challenges, there lived a wrestler whose name was Onami, meaning great waves. His body was magnificent, broad shoulders, powerful arms, and legs like tree trunks. In the private training halls, he was unstoppable. He could throw opponents twice his size and had even defeated his own teacher in practice matches. His technique was flawless, his strength legendary among those who knew him personally. But when Onami stepped into the public arena, everything changed. The moment he felt the eyes of spectators upon him, his confidence evaporated like morning mist. His powerful frame would begin to tremble, his breathing would become shallow and quick, and his mind would fill with doubt and self-consciousness. In these public contests, even his own students could defeat him. The very disciples he had trained and dominated in private would throw him easily when crowds gathered to watch. This contradiction tormented Onami. He knew his strength, had proven his skill countless times, yet he could not understand why his power abandoned him when it mattered most. The shame of these public defeats grew heavier with each match. He began to avoid competitions, retreating into the safety of private practice, but this only deepened his frustration. Finally, Onami decided to seek help from a Zen master. He had heard of Hakuju, a wandering teacher known for his unconventional methods and profound insight. When Hakuju arrived at a nearby temple, Onami hurried to meet him. He bowed deeply before the master and poured out his troubles. "I am strong in private, but weak in public," Onami confessed. "My body doesn't change, but my spirit fails me. I don't understand why this happens or how to overcome it." Hakuju listened carefully, studying the wrestler's face and posture. He could see the genuine strength beneath the surface anxiety, the potential power trapped by fear. "Great Waves is your name," the teacher said thoughtfully. "So stay in this temple tonight. Imagine that you are those billows. You are no longer a wrestler who is afraid. You are those huge waves sweeping everything before them, swallowing all in their path. Do this, and you will be the greatest wrestler in the land." With these words, the teacher retired, leaving Onami alone in the meditation hall. The wrestler sat in the traditional posture, trying to follow the instruction, but his mind wandered to many different things. Past defeats, future worries, the faces of spectators, the weight of expectations. Gradually, however, he began to feel something shift within him. As the night deepened, Onami's imagination began to take hold. He stopped thinking about wrestling and started becoming the waves themselves. He felt the vast power of the ocean rising within him, the irresistible force of water in motion. The waves in his mind grew larger and larger, crashing through the temple, sweeping away the flower arrangements, overwhelming even the Buddha statue in the shrine. By dawn, in his meditation, the entire temple had become nothing but the ebb and flow of an immense sea. When morning came, Hakuju found Onami still sitting in meditation, a subtle smile playing on his lips. The wrestler's entire presence had changed. There was a depth and power about him that hadn't been there before. The teacher gently patted his shoulder. "Now nothing can disturb you," Hakuju said with satisfaction. "You are those waves. You will sweep everything before you." That very day, Onami entered a wrestling contest. When he stepped into the ring, he no longer saw the crowd or felt their judgment. He was the ocean itself, vast and powerful and completely natural in its strength. He won every match effortlessly. From that day forward, no one in all of Japan could defeat him. The Buddha once said, "The mind is everything. What you think, you become." This ancient wisdom illuminates the profound transformation that occurred in Onami's consciousness. He discovered that his greatest enemy was not any external opponent, but his own self-limiting beliefs and fear of judgment. Why do we often perform far below our actual capabilities when others are watching? Zen Buddhism explains this phenomenon through the concept of self-consciousness. The way our attention becomes divided between the task at hand and our concern about how we appear to others. When we worry about our image, we lose connection with our natural abilities and authentic power. Look deeply at your own experience. How many times have you known exactly what to do in private, only to stumble when performing publicly? Perhaps you've experienced this giving presentations, having difficult conversations, or pursuing creative endeavors. The skills and knowledge remain the same, but our relationship to them changes when we feel observed and judged. Onami's transformation illustrates what Zen calls beginner's mind, the state of openness and natural action that exists before self-consciousness creates interference. Children often demonstrate this quality, performing complex physical feats without worry because they haven't yet learned to doubt themselves or fear judgment. The wave meditation that Hakuju prescribed worked because it shifted Onami's identity from wrestler who might fail to natural force that simply is. Waves don't worry about their performance or apologize for their power. They simply express their nature completely and without reservation. This identification with natural forces is a common Zen technique for accessing our inherent strength and wisdom. Zen teacher Alan Watts observed, "The art of living is neither careless drifting on the one hand, nor fearful clinging to the past on the other. It consists in being sensitive to each moment, in regarding it as utterly new and unique." Onami learned to approach each wrestling match as a completely fresh expression of his wave nature, without the burden of past defeats or future expectations. The deeper teaching here shows us that confidence is not something we build up or acquire from outside. It's our natural state when we stop interfering with ourselves through excessive self-monitoring and judgment. True confidence emerges when we identify with something larger than our small, worried self, whether that's the ocean's power, the sky's vastness, or simply our inherent Buddha nature. Tonight, as you consider areas of your life where fear holds you back from expressing your full potential, can you experiment with Hakuju's method? What natural force might you identify with to access your authentic power? Perhaps you're the mountain's steadiness in difficult conversations, the fire's warmth in creative expression, or the wind's freedom in taking risks. As Buddha taught, all that we are is the result of what we have thought. By changing the story we tell ourselves about who we are, we can transform our entire experience of life. Let us now turn to an ancient story about the complex relationship between love, judgment, and authentic spiritual realization. This is the life of Shunkai. In the flowering gardens of ancient Japan, there lived a woman whose beauty was matched only by the intensity of her spiritual seeking. Shunkai, also known as Satsu, moved through the world like a flame that both illuminated and sometimes burned everything it touched. Her large, expressive eyes held depths that seemed to contain both infinite tenderness and fierce determination. Even in simple robes, she possessed a natural grace that drew people to her like moths to candlelight. From early youth, Shunkai's path was marked by struggle against conventional expectations. She was compelled to marriage against her wishes when still young, her family prioritizing social arrangement over her personal desires. The experience of being treated as property rather than person ignited in her a rebellion that would shape her entire life. When this marriage ended, she pursued her education with passionate intensity, studying philosophy at the university where her brilliant mind flourished alongside her captivating presence. Love seemed to follow Shunkai wherever she went, but not the simple romantic love of fairy tales. Her love was complex, multifaceted, sometimes destructive. She fell in love with ideas, with people, with the very intensity of existence itself. At university, students and professors alike found themselves drawn to her magnetic presence. When philosophy no longer satisfied her deep spiritual hunger, she turned to Zen Buddhism, hoping to find in ancient wisdom what intellectual study could not provide. But even in the temple, the same patterns emerged. The Zen students, supposedly focused on transcending earthly attachments, found themselves attached to her. Her very presence seemed to stir up the desires and conflicts that meditation was meant to resolve. Yet beneath the surface attraction, there was something genuine in Shunkai's spiritual seeking that her brothers in the temple recognized and respected. In Kyoto, at the sub-temple of Kenin, Shunkai finally found what seemed like a spiritual home. Her sincerity impressed the monks, and one in particular became her spiritual companion, helping her navigate the complexities of Zen practice. For a time, it seemed she had found the balance between her passionate nature and the disciplined path of awakening. However, the temple's abbot, Mokurai, known as Silent Thunder, maintained strict traditional standards. He was a man who kept the ancient precepts with fierce dedication and expected the same from others. When he discovered monks' wives in his temples, he would chase them away with a broom, but his efforts seemed only to multiply the problem he was trying to solve. The wife of the head priest, watching Shunkai's growing influence and the praise her earnestness received, felt a jealousy that ate at her like acid. Unable to bear the comparison between her own conventional devotion and Shunkai's intense spiritual seeking, she began spreading rumors about Shunkai and her male companion. The poison of gossip worked its way through the temple community like fire through dry grass. As a consequence of these rumors, Shunkai's friend was expelled from the temple, and she herself was removed from the community that had finally seemed to understand her. Standing in the temple courtyard with her few possessions, Shunkai felt the familiar pain of rejection, but this time it was mixed with righteous anger. I may have made the mistake of love, she thought, but the priest's wife shall not remain in the temple either, if my friend is to be treated so unjustly. That night, driven by a fury that consumed rational thought, Shunkai took a can of kerosene and set fire to the 500-year-old temple. The ancient wooden structure, with its irreplaceable history and sacred artifacts, burned to the ground. In the morning, she found herself in police custody, watching the ashes of her spiritual home smolder in the dawn light. A young lawyer, moved by her story and perhaps by her beauty, tried to help reduce her sentence. But Shunkai, with the same intensity that had driven her to both spiritual seeking and destructive action, refused his help. "Do not help me," she told him. "I might decide to do something else which would only imprison me again." 7 years in prison followed. Even there, her magnetic presence continued to work its strange magic. The 60-year-old warden fell under her spell. But when she was finally released, the world had no place for her. Everyone saw only the scandal, the crime, the woman who had burned down a sacred temple. Even the Zen community, which preached enlightenment and compassion, shunned her completely. Shunkai discovered the painful truth that spiritual communities often struggle with their own shadows. The same people who spoke of universal Buddha nature and non-judgment turned away from her in disgust. Her own family disowned her. She grew sick, poor, and weak, surviving on the margins of a society that had definitively rejected her. In her final years, she found some peace through a Shinshu priest who taught her to call upon the Buddha of love. In this simple practice, she finally found the acceptance and forgiveness that had eluded her throughout her tumultuous life. She died still beautiful, still young at barely 30, her potential largely unrealized due to the judgments and limitations of her time. Before her death, she wrote her own story, hoping perhaps to earn enough to survive, but also to leave a record of a life that refused to conform to expectations. Some of her story reached a woman writer, and through her, the Japanese people learned of Shunkai's journey. Those who had rejected, slandered, and hated her now read of her life with tears of remorse. As the Buddha understood, 3 things cannot be long hidden: the sun, the moon, and the truth. The deeper teaching here shows us how society's judgments often prevent us from recognizing the sacred in unexpected forms. Shunkai's passionate nature, which could have been a source of great spiritual power, was channeled into destruction because she found no community wise enough to help her transform her intensity into wisdom. Why do we so often reject those who embody the very qualities we claim to value? Zen Buddhism reveals our tendency to prefer comfortable, predictable spirituality over the raw, transformative power of genuine awakening. Shunkai's love was too intense, her seeking too passionate, her responses too human for a community that preferred the appearance of transcendence to its messy reality. This tale points us toward understanding that authentic spiritual life includes all of our humanity, the beautiful and the ugly, the inspiring and the destructive. Shunkai's mistake was not her capacity for love, but her inability to find wise guidance for channeling that love constructively. The community's mistake was not their adherence to precepts, but their failure to extend compassion to someone whose spiritual journey didn't fit conventional forms. In Japanese culture, there is a practice called kintsugi, the art of repairing broken pottery with gold, making the repaired object more beautiful than the original. Shunkai's life was like a broken vessel that was never offered the gold of true understanding and acceptance. Instead of being transformed through wise guidance, her cracks became fractures that ultimately shattered her life. The Buddha taught, if you light a lamp for someone else, it will also brighten your own way. Those who rejected Shunkai missed the opportunity to be illuminated by her fierce dedication to truth, however imperfectly expressed. Her story reminds us that the path to awakening is rarely smooth or conventional, and that our capacity to hold space for others' struggles directly reflects our own spiritual maturity. Tonight, as you consider the outcasts and difficult people in your own life, can you look beyond their actions to the spiritual longing that might be driving them? Can you see past society's judgments to the Buddha nature that exists even in those who have made terrible mistakes? As Buddha said, hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule. Shunkai's life challenges us to extend this love not just to the obviously virtuous, but to those whose seeking has led them down dark paths. In learning to embrace the full spectrum of human spiritual experience, we discover the compassion that transforms both ourselves and our world. As we continue our journey, let us now turn to a story about acceptance and the art of contentment. This is the shepherd's wisdom. Along a dusty mountain road where wildflowers dotted the hillsides, a weary traveler encountered a shepherd tending his flock. The morning sun climbed steadily higher, and clouds gathered on the horizon, creating an uncertain sky that could promise either gentle rain or scorching heat. The shepherd sat peacefully on a smooth boulder, watching his sheep graze contentedly among wild grasses. His face bore the calm expression of one who had spent countless seasons under open sky, learning lessons that only nature can teach. There was something in his demeanor, a quality of unshakable serenity that drew the traveler's attention.
"Good morning, friend," the traveler called out, wiping sweat from his brow. "What kind of weather are we going to have today?"
The shepherd looked up with eyes that held mountain stream clarity and smiled with genuine warmth. "The kind of weather I like," he replied simply, as if this were the most obvious answer in the world. The traveler paused, confused. He had expected a practical forecast that would help him plan his day. Instead, he received what seemed like circular logic, offering no useful information. "How do you know it will be the kind of weather you like?" the traveler pressed, his voice carrying frustration mixed with curiosity. The shepherd's smile deepened, and he gestured toward the vast sky above them, where clouds and clear patches moved in their eternal dance. "Having found out, sir, that I cannot always get what I like," he said, with the patience of one who had learned life's most essential lesson, "I have learned to always like what I get. So I am quite sure we will have the kind of weather I like." The traveler stood in silence, the profound simplicity of this wisdom settling into his understanding, like seeds finding fertile ground. Here was a man who had discovered something that all the weather predictions in the world could not provide: complete freedom from the anxiety of uncertainty. As the Buddha observed, attachment is the root of suffering. What emerges from this story is the recognition that true contentment comes not from controlling external circumstances, but from transforming our relationship to whatever circumstances arise. Why do we exhaust ourselves trying to arrange life according to our preferences, rather than learning to find peace within whatever life presents? The shepherd represents what Zen calls great acceptance, not passive resignation, but the profound wisdom that recognizes resistance to reality as the primary source of suffering. When we fight against what is, we create an internal war that drains our energy and blocks our capacity for contentment. When we learn to align ourselves with reality as it unfolds, we discover the tremendous peace that comes from swimming with the current rather than against it. Consider how much mental and emotional energy we spend each day resisting circumstances beyond our control. Traffic jams, weather that doesn't match our plans, people who don't behave as we think they should. Each resistance creates a small contraction in our awareness, a tiny rebellion against reality that accumulates into chronic dissatisfaction. The shepherd's approach doesn't mean becoming passive or ceasing to have preferences. We can still hope for sunny days while fully accepting rainy ones. We can work toward goals while finding peace when outcomes differ from expectations. The key lies in holding our preferences lightly rather than allowing them to determine our contentment. Zen Master Seng Tsan wrote, "The great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences." This doesn't suggest eliminating all desires, but rather not allowing those desires to become demands that reality must fulfill for us to be okay. Look deeply at your own patterns of resistance. How often do you find yourself arguing with reality, wishing circumstances were different, or believing you'll be content when things change? This tension is optional, not because you should suppress your desires, but because you can learn to hold them more skillfully. The Buddha taught that attachment doesn't mean caring deeply about things. It means making our inner peace conditional on external circumstances, arranging themselves according to our specifications. The shepherd cares about his flock and appreciates comfort, but his fundamental contentment doesn't depend on any particular outcome. Tonight, as you reflect on the day's experiences, both pleasant and challenging, can you find the shepherd's secret within your own awareness? What if contentment isn't waiting for better circumstances, but is available right now through a shift in perspective? As the Buddha taught, happiness does not depend on what you have or who you are. It solely relies on what you think. The shepherd discovered that when we stop demanding that life conform to our expectations, we find the freedom to enjoy life exactly as it presents itself. Let us now turn to a tale about the nature of seeking and finding. This is the master sculptor's discovery. In a bustling stone quarry beneath towering mountains, a master sculptor moved among the marble blocks with the practiced eye of one who had spent decades coaxing beauty from stone. The morning sun cast golden light across the quarry, illuminating countless blocks that seemed to whisper their stories to him. "Aha!" he would say, running his weathered hands across smooth surfaces. "There is a heroic figure locked in that piece, and a saint trapped inside that other one." His reputation had grown precisely because of this gift, his ability to sense what he called the suchness of every stone, to see beyond raw material to its true nature waiting to be released. But on this morning, the sculptor's heart carried a different weight. For over 40 years, he had been searching for something special, the perfect block from which he could create his masterwork, a glorious statue of the Buddha. His energies were waning now, and still this elusive Buddha block remained hidden from him. He had traveled to great quarries around the world, consulted experts, hired specialists to scour remote areas, yet nowhere could he find that one perfect slab that would allow him to release the most perfect likeness of Buddha. Feeling the weight of his lifelong quest, the sculptor sought consolation from a local Zen priest who headed a small temple at the end of his street. The temple was modest, with a peaceful courtyard where a stone well sat, surrounded by carefully tended moss. "Master," the sculptor said, bowing deeply, "I have searched for 40 years for the perfect stone from which to carve the Buddha. My life's work remains incomplete." The priest listened with kind eyes, then smiled gently. "No problem," he said with such simplicity that the sculptor felt both confused and hopeful. "Do you mean you can tell me where I might find the perfect material from which I can release the Buddha of my dreams?" the sculptor asked, excitement rising in his voice. "Of course." "Where?" The priest raised his hand and pointed across the courtyard. "Over there," he said, indicating the stone well. The excited sculptor hurried to the well and peered down into the still, dark water. There, looking back at him with the same questioning eyes, the same lined face marked by years of searching, was his own reflection. Buddha's wisdom reminds us, if you cannot find the truth right where you are, where else do you expect to find it? The deeper teaching here shows us that what we seek most desperately often lies not in some distant place or perfect circumstance, but in the very ground of our own being. Why do we exhaust ourselves searching everywhere except within? Zen Buddhism reveals that we become so focused on the object of our search that we forget to examine the searcher. The sculptor had examined thousands of stones, traveled countless miles, yet never considered that the very consciousness doing the seeking was itself the perfect material for awakening. Consider how often throughout your day you postpone contentment, waiting for better circumstances. I'll be happy when I get the promotion, find the right partner, when conditions are finally perfect. This is seeking the Buddha block everywhere, except in the reflection looking back at us right now. Zen Master Huang Po taught, "Your everyday mind, that is the way." The sculptor's profound realization wasn't that he needed to become something different, but that he needed to recognize what he already was. The perfect material for expressing Buddha nature isn't found in external circumstances, but in the awareness that recognizes, seeks, and creates. The well represents the still point within consciousness, where seeking ends and finding begins. When we stop looking outward and peer into the depths of our own awareness, we discover that the one who seeks and the sought are the same. In Zen practice, we speak of original face, the essential nature that exists before conditioning. This original face isn't hidden in some special place. It's looking back at us from every mirror, every moment of genuine presence. Tonight, as you encounter the reflection of your own seeking mind, can you recognize the Buddha nature that has been with you all along? Perhaps it appears in your capacity for wonder, your longing for truth, or simply in the awareness that notices these very words. As the Buddha taught, look within, you are the Buddha. The masterwork you've been seeking isn't waiting for perfect materials. It's waiting for the recognition that the artist, the art, and the awareness that appreciates beauty are all expressions of the same essential nature. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us turn to a story about the difference between resistance and flow. This is the teaching of the old man and the waterfall. In a mountain village where a swift river carved its way through ancient rocks, an old Taoist sage often walked along the water's edge, observing the interplay between the flowing current and the solid stones that tried to redirect its path. The villagers knew him as a gentle, contemplative man who seemed to understand something profound about the natural world that others missed. One afternoon, as storm clouds gathered and rain began to fall, the river swelled with unusual force. The current grew violent and unpredictable, rushing toward a high waterfall that dropped into a rocky gorge below. Most people avoided the area during such conditions, knowing that anyone who fell into the rapids would face almost certain death against the jagged rocks at the bottom of the falls. The old man, however, had been caught by the sudden storm while walking along his usual path. As he tried to make his way back to safety, the muddy bank gave way beneath his feet. Before he could catch himself, he tumbled into the raging torrent and was immediately swept away by the powerful current. Villagers who witnessed his fall cried out in horror. They ran along the riverbank, helplessly watching as the old man was carried toward the waterfall by waters too violent and swift for any rescue attempt. They could only watch in anguish as he disappeared over the edge, plunging into the churning chaos below. Everyone assumed the worst. No one could survive such a fall, especially not an elderly man with limited strength. The villagers prepared themselves to search for his body downstream, once the waters calmed enough to make such a search possible. But to their amazement, as they hurried toward the base of the waterfall, they saw the old man emerging from the water far below, completely unharmed. He walked calmly to the shore, water streaming from his clothes, and sat down to rest as peacefully as if he had simply taken a refreshing swim on a pleasant day. The villagers rushed to him, unable to believe what they had witnessed. "How is this possible?" they asked in wonder. How did you survive that terrible fall? The water was so violent, the rocks so dangerous. By all reason, you should have been killed." The old man smiled at their concern and amazement. He wrung water from his sleeves and considered their question carefully before answering. "I survived," he said simply, "because I accommodated myself to the water, not the water to me. When I felt myself falling, I did not fight against the current or try to force it to change direction. Without thinking, I allowed myself to be shaped by it. When the water wanted to go down, I went down. When it swirled, I swirled with it. Plunging into the whirlpool, I came out with the whirlpool. I became like the water itself, and this is how I survived." The villagers listened in silence, beginning to understand that they had witnessed something far more than a fortunate accident. They had seen a demonstration of a profound principle that the old man had spent years learning from his careful observation of the natural world. As the Buddha taught, nothing is permanent. Everything is subject to change. Being is always becoming. Here we discover the wisdom of working with life's currents, rather than exhausting ourselves in futile resistance to forces beyond our control. Why do we instinctively fight against difficult circumstances when flow and adaptation might serve us better? Zen Buddhism reveals that our ego mind believes it can control external conditions through force of will. But this approach often creates more suffering than the original difficulty. The old man's survival wasn't mere luck. It was the result of understanding something essential about the nature of existence itself. When we align ourselves with the natural flow of events, rather than demanding that life conform to our preferences, we often discover resources and possibilities that resistance makes invisible. Consider your own relationship with challenging circumstances. How much energy do you spend fighting against situations you cannot change? The old man's teaching suggests a different approach, not passive submission, but conscious adaptation that maintains our essential nature while flowing with changing conditions. This doesn't mean accepting harmful situations or abandoning our values. The old man didn't give up his desire to survive. He simply changed his strategy for survival. Instead of fighting the water's power, he used it. Instead of resisting its direction, he moved with it while maintaining his awareness and intention. In relationships, careers, and personal challenges, we often face similar choices. We can exhaust ourselves trying to force outcomes, control other people's behavior, or make external circumstances conform to our expectations. Or we can learn to work skillfully with what is actually present, finding creative ways to achieve our deeper purposes through accommodation rather than force. Zen master Lao Tzu taught, "Water is fluid, soft, and yielding, but water will wear away rock, which cannot yield and is destroyed." The old man embodied this teaching, demonstrating that apparent weakness can be a source of tremendous strength when applied with wisdom. The Buddha said, "Hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule." This principle extends beyond hatred to all forms of resistance. Problems are rarely solved by fighting against them directly, but by understanding their nature and finding ways to work with the underlying forces involved. Look deeply at a current source of stress or conflict in your life. Where are you trying to force the water to change direction rather than learning to swim with it? What would it mean to accommodate yourself to the situation while maintaining your essential values and intentions? Tonight, As you encounter the inevitable currents of daily life, unexpected changes, difficult people, circumstances beyond your control, can you remember the old man's wisdom? Can you find ways to maintain your center while flowing with forces you cannot change, discovering that sometimes the most direct path to your goals is the one that appears to go around obstacles rather than through them? Buddha's wisdom reminds us, in the end, just three things matter: how well we have lived, how well we have loved, how well we have learned to let go. Learning to flow with life's currents is ultimately about letting go of our need to control everything while maintaining our ability to respond wisely to whatever arises. Like water, we can be both powerful and yielding, both persistent and adaptive, both strong and gentle. Our next story reveals the subtle poison of habitual negativity and the freedom found in contentment. This is the lesson of the monastery and the monk who never stopped complaining. In a remote mountain monastery known for its strict discipline and profound silence, a community of monks devoted themselves to deep spiritual practice. The monastery followed an ancient vow of silence, understanding that constant talking often distracts the mind from inner contemplation and genuine insight. For years at a time, the monks would practice in complete quiet, finding peace in the absence of unnecessary words. However, this particular monastery had one unusual tradition. Every 10 years, each monk was permitted to speak exactly 2 words to the head monk. This brief allowance acknowledged that sometimes practical concerns or spiritual insights might need to be communicated, while still maintaining the essential discipline of silence that supported their contemplative practice. One young monk entered this monastery with sincere intentions and dedicated himself to the demanding schedule of meditation, work, and study. But from the very beginning, he struggled with dissatisfaction. The simple accommodations felt uncomfortable, the plain food seemed inadequate, and the rigorous schedule challenged his preferences at every turn. After his first 10 years of practice, he went to the head monk for his permitted communication. The elder looked at him with kind, expectant eyes, ready to hear whatever wisdom or insight the decade of silent practice might have produced. "Bed hard," the monk said, using his 2 precious words to express his primary complaint about the sleeping arrangements. "I see," the head monk replied gently, making note of the comment, but offering no judgment or solution. The monk returned to his silent practice, but his dissatisfaction only seemed to deepen over the next decade. Instead of using the years to cultivate acceptance and inner peace, he spent his time dwelling on various discomforts and inadequacies he perceived in the monastery's provisions. His meditation became increasingly agitated as his mind rehearsed complaints he couldn't voice. When his second opportunity to speak arrived after another 10 years, he again approached the head monk. The elder greeted him with the same patient attention, curious to see how 2 more decades of practice might have influenced the monk's perspective. "Food stinks," the monk declared, using his allocated words to express his ongoing dissatisfaction with the simple vegetarian meals provided by the community. "I see," the head monk responded with unchanged equanimity, observing this second expression of complaint without surprise or criticism. Another 10 years passed, during which the monk's internal negativity continued to grow. Instead of finding freedom through spiritual practice, he had used 3 decades to perfect the art of mental complaining. His silent years were filled not with peace and insight, but with constant internal criticism of his circumstances. When his third opportunity for speech arrived, the monk appeared before the head monk with obvious agitation. 3 decades of accumulated dissatisfaction had finally reached its breaking point. "I quit," he announced emphatically, using his 2 words to express his ultimate decision to abandon the path he had never truly embraced. The head monk looked at him with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "Well, I can see why," he replied compassionately. "All you've ever done is complain." The Buddha taught, "We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world." This teaching reveals how the monk's 30 years of practice had actually reinforced the very patterns that caused his suffering rather than dissolving them. Why do we sometimes use spiritual practice to perfect our dissatisfaction rather than transcend it? Zen Buddhism points to our tendency to bring our habitual mental patterns into any environment, then blame external circumstances for our internal states. The monk never truly engaged with the practice. He simply endured it while maintaining his resistance. The monastery's conditions weren't the source of the monk's suffering. His attitude toward those conditions was. Countless other monks had found peace, insight, and profound contentment in the exact same circumstances. The difference lay not in what they experienced, but in how they related to their experience. Consider your own patterns of complaint and dissatisfaction. How much of your mental energy goes toward rehearsing grievances about circumstances you cannot change? The monk spent 30 years of precious life focused on bed hardness and food quality, instead of using those same years to develop inner freedom. This story also reveals the cumulative power of our mental habits. Each day, the monk chose complaint over acceptance. He strengthened neural pathways of dissatisfaction. Over 3 decades, these patterns became so ingrained that leaving seemed like the only option, when in reality, changing his perspective had always been available. Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh taught, "Thanks to impermanence, everything is possible." The monk's tragedy was his failure to recognize that his dissatisfaction was impermanent and changeable. Instead of working with his resistance, he fed it daily for 30 years until it consumed his entire spiritual journey. The Buddha said, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." The monk's 6 words over 30 years, all complaints, brought no peace to himself or others. Meanwhile, monks who used their practice to cultivate gratitude and acceptance found profound tranquility in the same conditions. Look deeply at your own relationship with current challenges. Where are you spending years complaining about circumstances that could be transformed through a shift in perspective? What would change if you used the same mental energy currently devoted to dissatisfaction to cultivate acceptance and inner peace? Tonight, as you notice the inevitable discomforts and imperfections of daily life, can you remember the monk's wasted decades? Can you choose gratitude over complaint, acceptance over resistance, understanding that your response to circumstances shapes your experience far more than the circumstances themselves? Buddha's wisdom reminds us, happiness does not depend on what you have or who you are. It solely relies on what you think. The monastery offered every monk the same opportunity for peace and awakening. Some found it, others did not. Not because of external conditions, but because of the quality of attention they brought to those conditions. In every moment, we face the same choice the monk faced daily: to practice complaining or to practice contentment. Let us continue our journey with a story about maintaining inner balance regardless of external circumstances. This is the teaching of Master Hakuin and the power of, "Is that so?" Master Hakuin lived in a small village where he was deeply respected for his wisdom, compassion, and exemplary character. For decades, he had maintained a reputation as a pure and enlightened teacher, someone who had transcended ordinary human weaknesses and embodied the highest spiritual ideals. Villagers often brought their problems to him, seeking guidance and inspiration from his teachings and his impeccable way of life. In this same village lived a beautiful young woman whose family was well known and respected. When she became pregnant outside of marriage, her condition caused a scandal that rippled through the tight-knit community. Her parents were furious and demanded to know who was responsible for bringing such shame upon their family. At first, the young woman refused to reveal the father's identity. She was protecting someone she loved, someone whose reputation and future would be destroyed if the truth came out. But as her parents' anger intensified and the pressure became unbearable, she made a desperate decision. In a moment of panic and confusion, she pointed to the one person she thought could weather this storm better than her actual lover, the respected Master Hakuin. When her outraged parents confronted the Zen master with their daughter's accusation, they expected protests of innocence, explanations, or at least some expression of shock at being falsely accused. Instead, Hakuin listened calmly to their angry words and simply replied, "Is that so?" His response only seemed to confirm their worst suspicions. Surely an innocent man would defend himself more vigorously. The scandal exploded throughout the village. People who had revered Hakuin as a saint now whispered that he was a hypocrite who had been living a lie. His reputation was destroyed overnight, and former students abandoned him in disgust and disappointment. When the child was born, the parents brought the baby directly to Hakuin. "This is your responsibility now," they declared bitterly. "Since you are the father, you must take care of this child." They thrust the infant into his arms and walked away, leaving him to face the consequences of a crime he had never committed. Again, Hakuin simply said, "Is that so?" and accepted the baby without protest or explanation. For many months, the former master cared for the child with tender attention. He fed the infant, changed diapers, walked the floors during sleepless nights, and provided all the love and care that any devoted parent would give. Neighbors who had once brought him offerings of food and respect now ignored him or spoke of him with contempt. He had lost his position, his reputation, and his livelihood, but he continued to care for the child with peaceful dedication. Meanwhile, the young woman struggled with the weight of her lie. Watching the revered teacher suffer for her deception while caring lovingly for a child that wasn't his became unbearable. The guilt consumed her until she could no longer live with what she had done. Finally, she confessed the truth to her parents. The real father was a young man in the village whom she had been trying to protect. Her parents were horrified to learn what they had done to an innocent man. They rushed to Hakuin's simple dwelling with profuse apologies. "Master, we have wronged you terribly," they said, bowing deeply. "Our daughter has confessed that you are not the father. We know now that you have suffered unjustly for our mistake. Please forgive us and allow us to take the child back to its real family." Hakuin listened to their apologies with the same equanimity he had shown to their accusations. As he gently placed the baby in their arms, he offered the same response he had given throughout the entire ordeal. "Is that so?" As Buddha's wisdom reminds us, hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule. What emerges from this story is the profound power of maintaining inner equilibrium regardless of how others perceive us or what circumstances life presents. Why do we allow external events and other people's opinions to determine our inner state? Zen Buddhism teaches that true freedom comes from developing an unshakable center that remains stable, whether we're being praised or blamed, honored or dishonored, treated fairly or unjustly. Hakuin's response, "Is that so?" represents a profound spiritual practice. He wasn't being indifferent or passive. He was demonstrating the ultimate non-attachment to reputation, status, and even justice itself. His consistent response showed that his sense of worth and purpose came from within rather than from external validation. Consider how differently most of us would react to false accusations, public humiliation, and complete loss of reputation. The natural human response is to defend ourselves, to fight against injustice, to demand that others see the truth. But Hakuin's approach reveals another possibility, meeting all circumstances with the same peaceful acceptance. This doesn't mean we should never defend ourselves or that we should passively accept all injustices. Hakuin's teaching is more subtle. He shows us that our inner peace doesn't have to depend on external circumstances being fair or favorable. We can maintain our center regardless of how the world treats us. The Buddha taught, "You will not be punished for your anger, you will be punished by your anger." Hakuin's equanimity protected him from the additional suffering that would have come from resentment, self-pity, or desperate attempts to restore his reputation. While the situation was undoubtedly challenging, he didn't compound the difficulty with emotional resistance. Look deeply at your own reactions to criticism, misunderstanding, or unfair treatment. How much of your suffering comes from the actual events, and how much comes from your mental and emotional responses to those events? Hakuin's example suggests that we have far more control over the second source of suffering than the first. Tonight, as you encounter whatever judgments, misunderstandings, or unfair treatments life may bring, can you remember Master Hakuin's peaceful, "Is that so?" Can you find the space between what happens to you and how you respond, discovering that your inner peace need not be held hostage by external circumstances? Buddha's wisdom teaches us, peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. True spiritual development isn't measured by how well life treats us, but by how gracefully we can meet whatever life brings, maintaining our compassion, dignity, and inner tranquility, regardless of whether the world recognizes our worth or understands our true nature. Let us continue our journey with a story about the transformative power of fearlessness and unconditional compassion. This is the tale of the thief and the Zen master. One quiet evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Zen master Shichiri Kojun sat in his simple home, reciting ancient sutras. His voice flowed rhythmically through the peaceful rooms, each word a meditation, each breath a prayer. The soft glow of candlelight danced across the walls as he immersed himself completely in the sacred texts, finding deep tranquility in the familiar verses. Suddenly, the serenity was shattered. The front door burst open with a violent crash, and a desperate man entered, brandishing a sharp sword that gleamed menacingly in the candlelight. His eyes were wild with desperation, his clothes dirty and torn, his breathing heavy from running. He had clearly chosen this isolated house because he believed it would be an easy target. A peaceful monk would offer no resistance. "Money or your life?" the thief demanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and aggression. He expected the old man to cower, to plead, to scramble frantically for whatever valuables he might have hidden away. But Shichiri didn't even look up from his sutra book. His voice remained calm and steady, as he continued reciting for a moment before pausing to address the intruder. "Please don't disturb my practice," he said, with the same gentle tone he might use to ask someone to close a door. "If you need money, help yourself. It's in that drawer over there." He gestured casually toward a simple wooden chest, then immediately returned to his recitation as if nothing unusual had occurred. The thief stood frozen, his sword still raised, completely bewildered. In all his years of stealing, he had never encountered such a reaction. No fear, no pleading, no anger, just matter-of-fact helpfulness, as if he were a neighbor who had stopped by to borrow something. Shaking his head in confusion, but proceeding with his business, the thief moved to the indicated drawer and began gathering the coins and small valuables he found there. The soft sound of the master's voice continued behind him, reciting sacred words as peacefully as if he were alone. Just as the thief was preparing to leave with his stolen goods, the master's voice called out again. "Wait," Shichiri said, finally looking up from his book. "Please don't take everything. I need some of that money to pay my taxes tomorrow. Leave a little for me, won't you?" The thief stared at him in amazement. Here was a man who was being robbed, calmly negotiating the terms of his own robbery, as if they were conducting normal business. Almost without thinking, the thief returned some of the money to the drawer. As he turned to leave, certain that this strange encounter was finally over, the master's voice stopped him once more. "You took my money," Shichiri called out, his tone carrying a note of reproach. "And you didn't even thank me. That's quite rude, don't you think?" This final comment left the thief completely speechless. His sword hand began to shake. Never in his most violent encounters had he been so thoroughly unnerved. Here was a man who treated robbery as if it were a favor, who was more concerned about politeness than personal safety. Thank you," the thief stammered, and then fled into the night as quickly as his legs would carry him. Later, when the thief was caught and confessed to numerous crimes, including the incident at Shichiri's house, the master was called as a witness. The court officials expected him to demand justice, to describe the terror and violation he had experienced. Instead, Shichiri spoke with the same calm clarity he had shown that evening. "This man did not steal anything from me," he testified. "I gave him the money freely. He even thanked me for it, though it took a little reminding." The thief, sitting in chains, felt something break open in his chest as he heard these words. This man had not only shown him extraordinary kindness in the moment of the crime, but was now protecting him from the consequences. For the first time in years, tears came to his eyes. Not tears of self-pity or anger, but tears of recognition. He had encountered something he had never experienced before: love without conditions. Upon his release from prison, the former thief sought out the master and begged to become his student. Under Shichiri's patient guidance, he learned to cultivate the same fearless compassion he had witnessed that night. Years later, through dedicated practice and the master's unwavering belief in his potential for transformation, he attained the deep peace and wisdom of enlightenment. As the Buddha observed, hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule. What emerges from this story is the revolutionary power of meeting violence with absolute peace, responding to taking with giving, and answering fear with love. Why do we instinctively believe that force must be met with force, that aggression requires defensive reaction. Zen Buddhism reveals that this pattern, while natural, often perpetuates the very conflicts it seeks to resolve. When we respond to hostility with hostility, we simply escalate the cycle of suffering. But when we respond with genuine compassion, not passive submission, but active love, we create space for transformation that wouldn't otherwise exist. Look deeply at your own experience. When someone approaches you with anger, criticism, or demand, what is your automatic response? Most of us immediately mobilize our defenses, preparing to protect ourselves through counterattack or withdrawal. But notice what happens in your body and mind during these defensive reactions. Does the tension decrease or increase? Does the conflict resolve or intensify? Shichiri's response demonstrates what Zen calls skillful means, acting from wisdom rather than reflex. His fearlessness didn't come from being unaware of danger, but from understanding something profound about the nature of reality. He recognized that the thief's aggression arose from desperation and suffering, not from inherent evil. By refusing to see him as an enemy, Shichiri created the possibility for the thief to see himself differently. In Zen practice, we cultivate what might be called the courage of defenselessness. This doesn't mean being naive about genuine danger or allowing ourselves to be harmed unnecessarily. Rather, it means developing the confidence to respond to difficult situations from our highest wisdom, rather than our most primitive instincts. The Buddha taught, in the end, just three things matter: how well we have lived, how well we have loved, how well we have learned to let go. Shichiri embodied all three in his encounter with the thief. He lived from complete presence, loved without conditions, and let go of any attachment to his possessions or even his personal safety. Consider the people in your life who challenge you: the difficult colleague, the critical family member, the aggressive driver in traffic. What would it mean to meet their energy with the same kind of fearless compassion Shichiri showed? Not by agreeing with them or submitting to their demands, but by refusing to match their level of reactivity, by staying connected to your own center of peace, regardless of their behavior. Tonight, as you encounter your own moments of tension or conflict, can you remember the master who treated a robber as an honored guest? Can you find the space between stimulus and response where choice lives, where you can decide to meet aggression with peace, taking with giving, fear with love? Buddha's wisdom reminds us, better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace. Sometimes the most powerful response to violence is simply to remain unshakable in our commitment to compassion, knowing that love has a transformative power that force can never match. Our next story reveals the difference between technical mastery and true mastery of oneself. This is the lesson of the archer and the bridge. A young man had devoted years to perfecting his skill with the bow and arrow. Day after day, he practiced in all weather conditions, his dedication absolute, his focus unwavering. His technique became flawless, his aim so precise that he rarely missed his target, even at great distances. Word of his remarkable ability spread throughout the region, and he began winning archery contests one after another, each victory feeding his growing pride and confidence. Flush with success, and perhaps a bit intoxicated by his own reputation, the young archer decided to seek out the ultimate challenge. He had heard whispered stories of an old Zen master who lived high in the mountains. a man renowned not only for his spiritual wisdom, but also for his legendary skill with the bow. I will challenge this old master, the young man thought, and when I defeat him, everyone will know that I am the greatest archer in all the land. He found the master's simple dwelling and issued his challenge with the confidence of youth. "Old man," he said, perhaps more boldly than was respectful, "I have heard of your reputation with the bow. I challenge you to demonstrate whether your skill can match mine." The master, ancient eyes twinkling with quiet amusement, simply nodded his acceptance. The young archer immediately set up his demonstration. He selected a target at a considerable distance, drew his bow with practiced precision, and let loose his arrow. It flew straight and true, striking the exact center of the bullseye with a satisfying thud. Without pausing, he notched a second arrow, drew, aimed, and fired again. This arrow split the first arrow down its center, a feat of such technical brilliance that few archers in the world could have accomplished it. The young man turned to the master with obvious satisfaction, his chest puffed with pride. "There," he said, gesturing toward his perfect demonstration. "Let's see if you can match that display of skill." The old master looked at the target, then at the young man, and smiled gently. But instead of drawing his own bow, he simply motioned for the archer to follow him. "Come," he said quietly, "let us find a more suitable place for this demonstration." Curious about what the old man had in mind, and confident that no location could diminish his superior abilities, the young archer followed the master up a winding mountain path. They climbed higher and higher, the air growing thinner, the path more treacherous, until finally they reached a place where the mountain was split by a deep chasm. Spanning this terrifying gap was a single fallen log, weathered and narrow, that served as a bridge between the two sides. Far below, so far that the bottom disappeared into shadow, the chasm yawned like a hungry mouth. The slightest misstep would mean certain death. Without a word, the old master calmly stepped out onto this precarious bridge. His movements were unhurried, graceful, completely at ease despite the mortal danger. When he reached the center of the log, where it sagged slightly and swayed with his weight, he paused and turned to face a distant tree on the far side of the chasm. Drawing his bow with the same casual precision he might use in his own garden, the master took aim and released his arrow. It flew across the void and struck the distant tree with a clean, direct hit. Not necessarily more accurate than the young man's shots, but accomplished under conditions that would challenge even the most seasoned warrior. The master then gracefully stepped back onto solid ground and gestured toward the log bridge. "Now it is your turn," he said simply. The young archer approached the edge of the chasm and looked down into the seemingly bottomless abyss. His mouth went dry, his palms began to sweat, and his legs trembled beneath him. The very thought of stepping onto that narrow, unstable bridge filled him with paralyzing terror. The technical skill that had made him so confident suddenly seemed irrelevant in the face of this primal fear. He tried to force himself forward, but his body refused to obey. His hands shook so violently that he couldn't even grip his bow properly, much less aim with any precision. The steady breathing and focused concentration that had served him so well in controlled conditions completely abandoned him. The master watched this struggle with compassionate understanding. "You have developed great skill with your bow," he observed gently, "but you have little skill with the mind that lets loose the shot. As the Buddha taught, the mind is everything. What you think, you become." This ancient wisdom illuminates the difference between mastery of technique and mastery of the mind that employs the technique. Why do we so often mistake technical proficiency for true mastery? Zen Buddhism points to our tendency to focus on external accomplishments while neglecting the inner development that makes those accomplishments meaningful. We perfect our skills in controlled environments, but discover our limitations when facing uncertainty, danger, or genuine challenge. The young archer had indeed achieved remarkable technical skill, but only under ideal conditions. When his environment changed, when fear entered the equation, when the stakes became real, when his sense of safety was threatened, his carefully cultivated abilities disappeared entirely. His mastery was revealed to be shallow, dependent on external circumstances rather than inner stability. Consider your own areas of expertise. How does your competence hold up under pressure? When faced with genuine stakes, unfamiliar circumstances, or emotional challenges, do your skills remain intact, or do they crumble like the young archer's confidence on the bridge? In Zen practice, we cultivate what might be called unshakable presence, the ability to remain centered and effective regardless of external conditions. This doesn't mean eliminating fear or challenge, but developing the inner stability that allows us to function skillfully even when afraid, uncertain, or under pressure. The master's demonstration wasn't about showing superior archery skills. It was about revealing the profound difference between skill that depends on perfect conditions and skill that emerges from inner mastery. His arrow didn't need to be more accurate than the young man's. It simply needed to be released from a place of genuine equanimity. Zen Master Bankei taught, "The unborn Buddha mind can handle any situation." This points to a quality of awareness that remains constant, whether we're shooting at safe targets or standing on precipices. It's the difference between confidence that comes from controlling our environment and confidence that comes from trusting our ability to respond wisely to whatever arises. The Buddha said, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." One arrow shot from genuine presence and inner stability has more value than 1,000 arrows shot from ego and carefully controlled conditions. True mastery reveals itself not in perfect circumstances, but in our ability to maintain our center when everything around us is uncertain. Look deeply at your own relationship to challenge and fear. Where in your life do you perform well in safe, controlled environments but struggle when stakes are raised or conditions become unpredictable? This isn't a failure. It's simply information about where your practice needs to deepen. Tonight, as you consider the various skills and competencies you've developed, can you distinguish between those that depend on perfect conditions and those that remain stable under pressure? Can you sense the difference between the confidence that comes from avoiding challenge and the confidence that comes from meeting challenge with presence? Buddha's wisdom reminds us, chaos is inherent in all compounded things. Strive on with diligence. Life is the bridge over the chasm, uncertain, sometimes frightening, always requiring us to find our balance, not in the safety of solid ground, but in our ability to remain centered while walking through space. True mastery isn't about perfect aim. It's about maintaining our equilibrium, no matter where we find ourselves standing. Because you have been told it. But after observation and analysis, when you find that anything agrees with reason and is conducive to the good and benefit of one and all, then accept it and live up to it. True spiritual maturity involves continuously examining our practices to ensure they serve their intended purpose, rather than simply preserving forms because they've become familiar. Let us continue with a story about the limits of understanding and the honesty of not knowing. This is the teaching of the Emperor and Master Gudo. The Emperor of Japan, a man accustomed to receiving definitive answers from his advisors and scholars, had arranged a private audience with Master Gudo, one of the most respected Zen teachers in the realm. The Emperor came with genuine curiosity about spiritual matters, particularly questions about life, death, and what might lie beyond ordinary understanding. Seated in the formal chamber where matters of state were usually discussed, the Emperor felt comfortable posing even the most profound questions to this renowned master. After all, if anyone would possess answers to life's deepest mysteries, surely it would be an enlightened Zen teacher who had spent decades in contemplation and practice. Master Gudo, the Emperor began with the directness that comes from a lifetime of authority. I have a question that has troubled many great minds throughout history. What happens to a man of enlightenment after death? Surely someone of your spiritual attainment would understand such matters. The Emperor expected a profound discourse on the nature of consciousness after physical death, perhaps insights into rebirth, karma, or the eternal nature of enlightened awareness. He was prepared to hear about subtle realms, the dissolution of individual consciousness into cosmic unity, or other elevated teachings that would satisfy his curiosity about this ultimate mystery. Instead, Master Gudo looked at the Emperor with complete equanimity and gave the most honest answer possible. How should I know? The Emperor was taken aback. Here was a master revered throughout the land for his wisdom, essentially admitting ignorance about what seemed like a fundamental spiritual question. But Master, the Emperor pressed, somewhat incredulous, you are an enlightened teacher. Surely you must have special knowledge about such things. Gudo's response was immediate and perfectly logical. Yes, sir, but not a dead one. The simplicity of this exchange contains a profound teaching about the nature of genuine wisdom and the difference between authentic understanding and pretended knowledge. As the Buddha taught, I know nothing except the fact of my ignorance. This ancient wisdom illuminates the profound honesty that characterizes true spiritual maturity, the willingness to admit the limits of one's knowledge, rather than pretending to understand what cannot be known from one's current position. Why do we expect spiritual teachers to have answers to questions that can only be resolved through direct experience? Zen Buddhism emphasizes the importance of distinguishing between conceptual knowledge and lived understanding, between what we can theorize about and what we can actually know. Master Gudo's response wasn't a failure of wisdom, but a demonstration of it. He refused to engage in speculation about experiences he hadn't had, even when pressed by someone in a position of great authority. His honesty revealed more wisdom than any elaborate theory about post-death consciousness could have provided. Consider how often in daily life we pretend to know things we don't actually know. Whether it's offering confident opinions about complex social issues, giving definitive advice about other people's relationships, or claiming certainty about uncertain outcomes, we often feel pressured to appear knowledgeable rather than admitting the limits of our understanding. The Emperor's assumption that enlightenment should include knowledge about death reflects a common misconception about spiritual development. We imagine that awakening provides a comprehensive database of cosmic information rather than a fundamental shift in how we relate to not knowing. In Zen practice, we cultivate what Suzuki Roshi called "don't know mind," a state of open awareness that doesn't need to fill every gap in understanding with theories or beliefs. This isn't ignorance, but a wise recognition. that direct experience is more valuable than second-hand information. Zen Master Linchi taught, "There is nothing special to do, nothing special to learn." Enlightenment doesn't grant supernatural knowledge about matters beyond ordinary experience. A living master knows about living. What happens after death remains in the realm of speculation until one actually dies. The Buddha said, "Believe nothing merely because you have been told it. But whatsoever, after due examination and analysis, you find to be conducive to the good, the benefit, the welfare of all beings, that doctrine believe and cling to." Even the Buddha encouraged direct investigation over accepting claims based on authority. Gudo's teaching reveals the freedom that comes from releasing the need to have opinions about everything. How much mental energy do we waste constructing theories about things we cannot possibly know? How much suffering comes from worrying about scenarios we can only imagine? Look deeply at your own relationship with not knowing. Where do you pretend certainty to avoid the discomfort of uncertainty? What would change if you could say, "I don't know," with the same confidence that Master Gudo displayed? The emperor sought knowledge about death from someone who was vibrantly alive. But true wisdom might be found not in accumulating information about future experiences, but in fully engaging with present reality. The mystery of death is honored not by pretending to solve it, but by living authentically in the face of it. Tonight, as you encounter questions about the future, about others' motivations, or about cosmic mysteries, can you remember Master Gudo's honest simplicity? Can you find the courage to admit when you don't know, discovering that don't know mind might be wiser than all our clever theories? Buddha's wisdom reminds us, the only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing. In a world full of false certainties and confident ignorance, the Master's honest, "How should I know?" points toward a more genuine relationship with mystery, one that honors what cannot be known, while fully embracing what can be directly experienced. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us explore a story about true spiritual power. This is the tale of the miracle of ordinary living. At Ryumon Temple, the renowned Zen master Bankei was sharing the Dharma with a large gathering of devoted students. The hall was filled with people sitting in quiet attention, absorbing his simple yet profound teachings about living with natural awareness. The evening light filtered through the temple windows, creating an atmosphere of peace and contemplation. In the midst of his discourse, a disturbance arose near the back of the hall. A Shinshu priest, whose own temple had been losing followers to Bankai's growing reputation, pushed his way through the crowd with obvious agitation. His face was flushed with jealousy, and his movements were sharp with competitive energy. Bankai paused his teaching and looked toward the commotion with patient curiosity. "What is this noise that interrupts our evening together?" he asked gently, his voice carrying no irritation despite the disruption. The priest stood up boldly, his voice rising above the murmur of the crowd. "The founder of our sect," he boasted loudly, "had such miraculous powers that he held a brush in his hand on one bank of the river. His attendant held up a paper on the other bank, and the teacher wrote the holy name of Amida through the air. Can you do such a wonderful thing?" The gathered students turned their attention between the challenging priest and their teacher, curious how Bankei would respond to this test of his spiritual abilities. Some expected a demonstration of supernatural powers. Others wondered if their master would engage in debate. Bankai smiled, with the gentle amusement of someone who understood the priest's confusion completely. Perhaps your fox can perform that trick, he replied lightly. But that is not the manner of Zen. My miracle is that when I feel hungry, I eat, and when I feel thirsty, I drink. The temple fell into profound silence as the simple profundity of these words settled into the hearts of those present. The priest, expecting magical displays, found himself face to face with a teaching about the extraordinary nature of ordinary experience. The Buddha once said, "If you want to know your past, look at your present condition. If you want to know your future, look at your present actions." This ancient wisdom illuminates how real spiritual power manifests not in supernatural demonstrations, but in complete presence to what is actually happening. Why do we seek the miraculous outside of our immediate experience? Zen Buddhism reveals our tendency to bypass the profound simplicity of life in search of dramatic spiritual experiences. We imagine enlightenment as something exotic, supernatural, or removed from daily existence, when in truth, it's the capacity to be fully present to whatever is arising. The heart of this lesson lies in understanding that consciousness itself is the ultimate miracle. The fact that you can taste food, feel thirst, hear these words, or experience any sensation at all is more extraordinary than any magic trick. Yet, we take these everyday miracles for granted while seeking special powers that would somehow validate our spiritual development. Look deeply at your own experience right now. Can you feel the miracle of breathing without having to think about it? The wonder of your heart beating steadily? The extraordinary fact that light enters your eyes and somehow becomes the vision of these words? These are the real miracles available in every moment. Zen teacher Suzuki Roshi taught, "Each of you is perfect the way you are, and you can use a little improvement." This paradox points to the Zen understanding that we don't need to become someone special to access spiritual truth. We need to fully inhabit who we already are. The Buddha taught, there are only two mistakes one can make along the road to truth: not going all the way and not starting. The path is not about developing supernatural abilities, but about going all the way into the simple reality of this moment, starting exactly where you are, with whatever you're experiencing right now. Consider how the priest's question revealed his own spiritual materialism. The belief that wisdom can be measured by impressive displays rather than by the quality of one's presence. This trap catches many seekers who mistake the extraordinary for the spiritual, when the truly spiritual is found in bringing complete attention to the ordinary. Tonight, as you eat your next meal or drink a glass of water, can you taste the miracle that Bankai pointed to? Can you experience the wonder of simple biological processes that sustain your life? As the Buddha said, the way is not in the sky, the way is in the heart. The miracles we seek are not above us, but within the simple reality of being alive.